Welcome to the Proskauer Brief, Hot Topics in Labor and Employment Law. I'm Guy Brenner, a partner in Proskauer's Employment Litigation and Counseling Group based in Washington, D.C., and I'm joined by my colleague, Jonathan Slowick, Senior Counsel in our practice group based in Los Angeles. Today's episode is about laws requiring employers to conduct bias audits and impact assessments to ensure their artificial intelligence tools, or AI tools, are not resulting in illegal discrimination. Jonathan, thank you for joining me today.
Very happy to be here, Guy.
So, Jonathan, can you begin by giving us a quick primer on the laws we're talking about and the AI tools at issue?
Sure. So, New York City's Local Law 144, which took effect in 2023, and Colorado's Artificial Intelligence Act, which will take effect in February 2026, target AI tools used by employers to make or assist in making decisions in the employment context. The focus of these laws is on technologies that assist employers with conducting tasks that are otherwise intensive or costly, like resume screening and performance management. These tools have become quite popular as employers have been inundated with resumes for job openings that applicants can submit on various tools, especially online, that facilitate the application process. Given the volume of these applications, in many cases, there's just simply no way for employers to review all of the resumes. And a lot of those resumes are from unqualified candidates. So AI tools can quickly review all of those resumes or applications and identify promising candidates. And this process can save companies significant time and resources.
Yeah, that efficiency you mentioned is precisely why these tools are so attractive for employers. So why would New York City and Colorado's laws want to target this technology?
So it boils down to what is often referred to as algorithmic bias. We've discussed this in previous episodes of this podcast, and for a full explanation of what algorithmic bias is in the AI context specifically, I encourage listeners to tune into those episodes. But at a high level, basically, these AI tools are not infallible. In most cases, the tools are only as good as the data that was used to train them. And if that data is problematic in some way, for example, if it's not representative of the population applying for the jobs, if it contains biases, or if there's simply not enough data, it's possible for the tool to disfavor certain groups of applicants or employees unintentionally. So in a worst case scenario, the tool might have been unintentionally trained in a way that produces biased outcomes on the basis of protected characteristics like race, sex, or religion.
Right. And as we've talked about in our prior episodes, what you put into AI, determines what you get out of it. And if the data used to train the AI reflects biases, even unintentionally, you can run into some trouble. So what do these laws require employers to do to address this bias issue?
So in each in their own bespoke way, these laws basically require employers to test the tools for bias. These requirements to test for bias apply when tools are used for certain purposes or deployed in certain ways. The New York City law refers to this testing process as conducting a, quote, bias audit. The Colorado law uses slightly different terminology. It refers to them as impact assessments. But these are really referring to practically the same thing. The idea is that employers need to test these tools to ensure that they're operating as intended and not creating unintentionally biased or discriminatory outcomes.
All right, so let's take a look at New York City's law. What do the bias audits look like there? What's required?
So New York City requires bias audits of what's referred to in the ordinance as automated employment decision tools. That term, automated employment decision tools, is defined to include AI or any other algorithmic tool that, quote, issues simplified output, including a score, classification, or recommendation that is used to substantially assist or replace discretionary decision-making for making employment decisions that impact natural persons. Now, on its face, that language substantially assist might seem really broad and cover a wide range of use cases, but there's an implementing rule that narrows the scope of that language significantly. Under this rule, to substantially assist or replace discretionary decision-making means either one, to rely solely on a simplified output with no other factors considered, two, to use the simplified output as one of a set of criteria where the simplified output is weighted more than any other criterion in the set, or three, to use the simplified output to overrule conclusions derived from other factors, including human decision-making.
All right, so it sounds like the test is, does the AI essentially make the decision, or is a significant factor in making the decision? And so in those circumstances, bias audits are triggered under New York City's law. So Jonathan, all three of those circumstances that trigger the bias audit requirements in New York City are situations where the employer has meaningfully delegated its discretion to the AI tool. Is that right?
Yeah, these are all situations where the tool is more or less making the decision, or the tool is so important that human decision makers are largely deferring to its output when they're making decisions. On the other hand, if the tool is merely providing one data point among several that a human decision maker is taking into account, then these bias audit rules don't apply under the New York City law.
So Jonathan, surely there are some employers who are using automated tools that trigger the bias audit requirement under the New York City ordinance. You know, what do rules require in cases where they apply?
So there's a detailed set of requirements that's set forth in the law. But in summary, the employer has to conduct a bias audit annually and publish the results of that audit on their website. That's the main summary of what the employer needs to do. The bias audit needs to be performed by an independent auditor, and it needs to examine what the law refers to as the selection rate. So this is the rate at which applicants are selected for an employment decision, like hire or promotion. Or if there's no selection rate, so to speak, it must examine what is called the scoring rate. So the rate at which an applicant or an employee receives a score above the sample's median score. And these rates are calculated and examined for individuals based on their race, ethnicity, and sex. And then also there's an intersectionality component. So also various combinations of those characteristics. So once those rates are calculated, they're compared to the rates for the highest selected or highest scoring candidates. And that creates, that comparison creates what the law calls an impact ratio.
Sounds like a pretty detailed set of requirements to look under the hood of these tools and see how they're operating. So let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about what's required under Colorado's law.
There are some important similarities between Colorado and New York City. The Colorado Artificial Intelligence Act, like the New York City law, also requires impact assessments to be completed on an annual basis. There's an additional trigger, though. It also requires these assessments to be completed within 90 days of any intentional or substantial modification to the AI tool. So like New York City, there's, the nuts and bolts of this process is laid out in a lot of detail. In Colorado, the impact assessment needs to include a number of statements, metrics, and analyses. Some of the key ones are: 1, a clear statement disclosing the purpose, intended use, and benefits of the AI tool. 2, an analysis of whether the AI tool poses any known or reasonably foreseeable risks of algorithmic discrimination, the nature of that risk, and the steps taken to mitigate that risk. And 3, a description of the post-deployment monitoring and user safeguards provided, including the oversight, use, and learning process the employer will use to address any issues that arise.
Wow. These bias audits and impact assessments sound pretty rigorous. It might sound more rigorous than the actual benefit you're supposed to gather from using the tool. As a practical matter, right? What if the employer just doesn't have the historical data needed that appears to be fueling these bias audits?
The New York City law speaks to this explicitly. It allows first-time users of the tools to rely on data from other employers who use the same tool, or on test data if there's insufficient data about the employer's own track record using the tool. Even if an employer is not a first-time user, so they've used the tool in the past, there's still a provision that allows employers to rely on data that's not limited only to that organization if certain requirements are met. The most important one of which is that the employer needs to also make its data available for that purpose.
So Jonathan, what happens if after conducting one of these analyses, it appears that there potentially was some sort of disparate impact occurring as it relates to a protected group?
So the New York City law doesn't actually say, so there's no explicit requirement under the New York City law that the employer do anything necessarily. Now, that being said, of course, there are existing laws against discrimination in employment. that are generally broad enough to encompass decisions made or assisted by an AI tool. So it's no defense to say that the AI did it. The practical effect of that is if there is a bias audit revealing evidence of algorithmic discrimination, that's going to be a strong incentive for the employer to take some kind of action, whether that's changing how they use the tool or just discontinuing use of the tool completely. So interestingly enough, although California doesn't require bias audits, regulators there have taken a similar approach. There are regulations that are expected to become final this summer that state that it's, quote, relevant to a discrimination claim or to the employer's defense if the employer has taken action in response to anti-bias testing. On the other hand, Colorado's law does have some explicit requirements placed on the employer if an impact assessment does uncover evidence of a disparate impact. So if an impact assessment reveals algorithmic discrimination, a Colorado employer needs to notify the state attorney general within 90 days. If the Colorado attorney general brings an enforcement action against the employer will have a rebuttable presumption that it used reasonable care if it has a risk management policy that complies with certain statutory requirements and if it has made that timely disclosure to the attorney general.
Jonathan, as we discussed, and you mentioned earlier, not all applicants are created equal. And part of the reason these tools are so attractive is because there are so many applicants applying who are not qualified for the job. OFCCB recognized that because not all applicants are really equally qualified or even qualified at all, there should be a series of standards to determine who and should not be included as an applicant for purposes of the analysis. For example, many candidates, as we discussed, don't meet the basic qualifications for the position. Under OFCCB's guidance, such candidates would be removed from the analysis entirely because there was no way that individual would have been hired or could have been hired, irrespective of their race or sex. Similarly, if a candidate withdrew, they should be removed from the analysis as well because there's no way that you could hire them. They withdrew themselves. They said they're not interested anymore. So that helped make the analysis more accurate because you were only considering those who were qualified and wanted the job. I don't know if New York City or Colorado have thought about these issues, and I'm unaware of any guidance they've provided to employers. So employers in those jurisdictions need to think about how they're going to conduct these audits before employing the AI tools. For example, do they need to collect race and sex information from their applicants to have data to conduct the analyses? How will they safeguard that information? Do they need an applicant tracking system like government contractors used to have that includes codes that identify candidates that can be removed for audit purposes? Who needs to be trained on how to properly code those candidates? I mean, these and other questions, and implementing any desired sort of outcomes requires planning, time, resources, and training. This isn't something that employers can just do on the fly. They really need to think about it.
Yeah, those are really good points. And it's not clear, I think, to me at least, that the states considering these kinds of bias audit laws or New York City have fully thought those questions through. I think moving forward, it's worth keeping an eye on Colorado, considering that law does not even take effect until February of 2026, and maybe amended before then. When he signed the bill into law in 2024, the Colorado governor, Jared Polis, issued a really remarkable signing statement. He signed the legislation into law, but expressed reservations about how broad-reaching it was, and he urged stakeholders to amend it to, I think he said, fine-tune the law before it takes effect. And then more recently, in May of this year, the governor, Senator Michael Bennet, and some other prominent Colorado elected representatives issued a letter urging the legislature to delay implementation of the law even further until January of 2027, to give all the stakeholders time to make those reforms that Governor Polis had called for when he initially signed the bill.
Well, it sounds like people recognize that these laws have, significant burdens that need to be thought through and prepared for, and we'll see if the Colorado legislature listens. I think what's also important for employers to consider is the publication requirement, particularly under New York City's laws. Certainly, no employer will want to publish the results of a bias audit reflecting that there may have been a problem with their AI tool or that there was some kind of bias in the hiring process. That's likely to spur some unfavorable results, potentially litigation. Also, I worry that just because data suggests an adverse impact, that doesn't mean that discrimination occurred. Sometimes the race or sex of a candidate chosen doesn't reflect the predominant groups in the applicant pool. That won't be reflected in the bias analysis and will likely lead to confusion and unnecessary disputes. Again, this is something I don't think New York City or Colorado have thought about. The last thing I'll say is that as other jurisdictions look to regulate AI tools in the employment context, I fear that they're likely going to look at New York City and Colorado as models and will likely incorporate some form of audit process into their laws. So if you're an employer outside of Colorado or New York City, this may not impact you yet, but it may soon.
Yeah, I think a lot of jurisdictions may be looking to, since the Colorado law was statewide law, to require this kind of process. And since it's still a work in progress itself, I think maybe other jurisdictions may be looking to Colorado as a bellwether in this regard. But other jurisdictions have not been sitting on the sidelines. I mean, the New York State Senate has considered a bill that would require developers and deployers of so-called high-risk AI systems, which could include employers, to require these developers and deployers to conduct audits as well to evaluate these kinds of risks of algorithmic discrimination. As lawmakers continue to grapple with these tools available to employers, we can assume that, if Congress doesn't say they can't, that jurisdictions will continue to regulate in this space more and more as the tools become more widespread. And so these kinds of mandatory bias audits could be coming to more places, and we'll just need to wait and see.
Very interesting, Jonathan, and all the more reason for employers to remain vigilant and to keep a close eye on these developments. This was a great conversation, and Jonathan, I look forward to having many more of these conversations and podcasts in the future. To those listening, thank you for joining us on the Proskauer Brief today. Also, be sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, and Spotify so you can stay on top of the latest hot topics in labor and employment law.